this is where I think your work does well, is that you provide a backdrop of where people are living. You're describing their water, as you mentioned before, and that's what I've enjoyed about the book as I was reading through it. And you hit one box after another, and you brought in so many different illustrations and pictures. Like you mentioned the parable of the prodigal son. I know I think you were influenced a little bit by Keller there.
Yeah, you think?
A little bit. And well, you also talk about him in his book, like his book on idols. And you mentioned a bit of that. But I love the fact that you did contrast the parable of the prodigal son, and you contrast it with you identified in that, the self-righteous brother. I think, though, it's important, and I want to hear why you felt you felt it was important to address both brothers in the middle of that story. So go ahead and explain that if you will.
Yeah, definitely. So obviously the parable of the prodigal son is a favorite of all of ours. I mean, it's one that is retold in culture. And it's one that we all know, even if you're not probably a Bible reader, if you're in Western culture, you have an idea of what a prodigal is. But I do think so much so much ink has been spilled on the prodigal himself, the younger brother himself, and that is good and helpful. I see myself in him as well. But sometimes we forget that he did have an older brother who stayed behind. And we see this, the idolatry in the younger brother is that pursuit of the good life in the far country, leaves father, leaves home, takes the money and goes and pursues debauchery, reckless living, foolish living. And then that comes up short and he returns home. But the older brother has stayed home the whole time, as you know, and he has worked hard for the father. But what we find at the end of the parable is the son speaking to the father, this older son who always obeyed and always did the right thing, speaking to the father in a very transactional way. I've always obeyed you. I've always done what you wanted. And how do you treat me? What's my payment in return? And so our eyes are opened then to this older brother who didn't view his relationship with the father as one of mutual caring for and building up of one another and working side by side and laboring together. But he saw himself as a servant who deserved to be paid by the master. And so the point of me lacing both brothers throughout the entire book is it's easy for us to identify the prodigal. It's easy for us to say, yeah, there's the guy who goes out and spends all his money on prostitutes, or there's the woman who is inside the church and maybe leaves to have a lot of sex or have an abortion or whatever. It's easy to point at that sibling in Christ because they're very identifiable. But I wanted us who are in the church to think, okay, what are my idols? Where am I placing my identity? What are my pursuits? If I'm not tempted by things like abortion or multiple sexual encounters, where have I then put my hope and trust? And are we a bit like the older brother? Do we see ourselves in him saying to our Father in heaven, I have obeyed you. I have done all the right things. I've done just what you asked right here at home. And yet this is how you pay me. This is how you treat me. No, do we perform or behave in such a way that we expect our Father in heaven to sort of pay us back for that? And so I wanted to speak to my sisters who have gone to a far country and my sisters who have stayed home but maintained a transactional relationship with their God in heaven. And I think if we're honest, we can all see ourselves in both brothers. But I wanted to point my siblings to just the goodness of the Father in both stories. The Father who goes out to both sons, who entreats both sons to come in, to come home, to come to the feast. He's tender towards both sons. And I'm so grateful for that. And I hope as much, cultural exegesis as happens in the book, I hope that the readers' hearts are drawn home to the heart of the Father. I hope they close the book and go, yeah, home is where I want to be at the feast that my Father has made.